Hi everyone, Brian here, and welcome back to another episode of my somewhat irregular and I hope somewhat irreverent and also illuminating series Tarot to the Nines, where I am looking at every card in the tarot deck through the lens of number. Except today we're looking at some cards not quite through the lens of number, because we are actually talking about the only set of cards that I have not yet discussed in the tarot deck, and that is the somewhat unfathomable and elusive tarot court cards. Those cards that make many people break out in a cold sweat because they don't quite know how to read them, they're not sure they understand them, they sometimes find them confusing, they sometimes find them a bit scary, or sometimes just go when one of those turns up in the reading. And I'm not saying this in any kind of pejorative sense, because I have been there. I have been there where I've been reading my tarot cards, dealing them out, and up pops the Queen of Pentacles and the King of Swords, and I find myself thinking, what am I going to do with you guys? Well, this video is about helping you to determine what you do with those guys and how you work with them in a tarot reading. I should tell you up front that I'm not going to reach any definitive conclusion about how to work with the court cards, because as you're about to see, and as you probably know already, there are many different interpretations of the court cards. But here's what I'm going to do. I am going to try and take you through some different approaches to looking at the court cards. We're going to start by looking at the court cards as people, how they might represent actual people in your life, and that means other people and yourself as well, because you're a people too. And we're also going to then look at them as personality types, as different kind of personality qualities that you can find in other people, because as we know, people aren't just one thing. There are lots of things, usually quite contradictory things, all mushed up together. And that's again true of other people and also of yourself. So we'll look at it through the lens of personality as well. And also when I do that, I'll talk a little bit about the Myers-Briggs personality typing process and how that relates to the tarot court cards. Then I'm going to have a look at tarot courts in terms of their elements and their elemental qualities, and how do you combine the different element qualities depending on the rank of the court card and the suit that it comes from. Not an easy process when you discover that people do not agree on which element relates to which suit, and they don't agree on which element relates to which rank in the court card. They don't always even agree what to call each court card, even when the court cards are representing the same thing. So that's going to be fun. And then, because this is Tarot to the Nines, and because it is my series in which I'm looking at tarot through the lens of number, I am going to do something that is probably quite sacrilegious. I am going to look at the court cards as though they were numbered cards. Now, call me crazy, but this is Tarot to the Nines, so we have got to do something that relates it to number. And in all seriousness, there is something about the sequence of the tarot court cards that tells you something about what they are telling you about the sequence of events or the sequence of energies that you are dealing with in a tarot reading. Not as simple as it might sound, because then we have to ask the question, what order do the court cards arrive in? Does the page come after the 10 and then go to the knight and the queen and the king? Or, as some tarot readers would have it, does the king pop out after the 10? And is there a descent from the king to the queen to the knight to the page? There are different interpretations here as well. So this is going to be a bit of a ride, so I suggest you fasten your seatbelts, get yourself a drink, have a nice cup of tea, possibly a Valium, and we will go into the crazy world of the 4 families of the tarot. Okay, so now I want to look at the tarot court cards as representatives of people, either other people in your life or you yourself. But what does it mean if a tarot court card appears and in a reading is representing a person? Well, the first thing to say is that even if you don't think of the tarot court cards as likely representatives of people, there is one common way that very many tarot readers, regardless of how they view the court cards, use a court card as a representative of a person. And that, of course, is when you use one of the court cards as a significator in a reading. So the way that I learned tarot was you look at your court cards and you pick a court card that represents either yourself if you're doing the reading for yourself, or your querent if you're doing a reading for them. And very often, of course, you're told things like, if it's a woman, then you should pick a queen, And if it's a man, you should pick a king. And if it's a young person, very young person, it should be a page. And if it's a slightly older young person, it should be a knight. And if they've got blonde hair and blue eyes, then probably you should be looking at the suit of wands. And if they've got dark hair and kind of swarthy skin, then perhaps it's pentacles, and etc, etc, etc. So now, in the old days, that was something that was really quite a common thing to do. You also were then expected to be able to understand the level of maturity of the person that you were dealing with, and that would help you pick the significator. But as we'll see in a second, it's not always as simple as that. But that's one way that the tarot cards can represent an individual. Now, the other way of looking at it is that the tarot cards can represent a set of people in a family. So it could be like father, mother, son, daughter. You know, father, mother, son, daughter. For king, queen, knight and page. Or it could represent actual royal families. So you have kings, queens, knights and pages. That's the most kind of obvious thing. They are actually royal families in most tarot decks, or at least in most traditional tarot decks. Although many of the suit and court card names are changed in different tarot decks, partly because of the problems that we're about to uncover. The other way of looking at it is that they represent age and gender and characteristics and so on. So as I mentioned, you know, kings would be male, queens would be female, knights would be kind of older young person, and pages would be younger young people. And we're often told that pages can mean male or female, knights are young men, and queens are women, and kings are male. But there's a problem there, which I'm sure you've noticed even immediately, and that is that instantly you set something up where men outnumber women in terms of the tarot court, because you have got, according to that theory, two definite males, a definite female, and then somebody who could be male or female. So you've got male, female, male, maybe female. So instantly you're down a bit in terms of your representatives for females. So the other thing, of course, is that this is all based on the idea that everyone in the world, apart from the fact that everyone is white in this kind of world, that everyone in the world is cisgendered and straight. So when you start looking at relationships between kings and queens, then very often that means a married couple. If it's a king and a knight, then perhaps that's father and son. If it's a queen and a page, then that's mother and son or daughter. But of course, not everyone in the world is white, not everyone in the world is straight, and not everyone in the world is cisgendered. So I think it's far more helpful to look at these cards as actually not being gendered in the way that we think of. So kings can be male or female, queens can be male or female, knights can be young person who's male or female, pages can be even younger person who's male or female. So there are different ways of looking at them, and I think if we stay rigidly attached to what they look like, then we lose some of the nuances that we could potentially explore within the deck. So those are some of the problems of looking at them in terms of actual people that are related directly to the characteristics that seem obvious in the cards. What I find most useful if you're talking about people, either yourself or other people, is to think about these cards as more about being levels of maturity. And that means that every one of them could either be male or female or straight or gay or bisexual or transsexual, or, you know, however you identify. Any one of these cards could represent you, and any one of these cards could represent the person you're reading for, and any one of these cards could represent anyone else in your life or in your querent's life. But what they do tell us about is something to do with the level of maturity. Now, pages, let's just start with pages, because that's the common place that we start in the courts. The pages are the youngsters of the court, the more innocent of the court, the beginners of the court. So they are the ones who are beginning to find their way in life, are studying and looking at the world, trying to explore what it means, or maybe setting themselves up in the world, or just beginning to get a sense of who they are looking at how the world responds to them, thinking about the way that the world is, and thinking about what they want to do in the world, what they want to do and what they want to achieve. The knights are moving into action, and you'll see in, obviously in the Rider-Waite deck, they're all on horseback. Two of them, the Knight of Swords and the Knight of Wands are very much in motion and moving forward. The Knight of Cups seems to be kind of sauntering, his horse is rather hesitantly stepping forward, but a bit of forward motion there. And the Knight of Pentacles feels and looks fairly rooted and solid and in place. But nonetheless, they are on a vehicle, and they are on a vehicle that allows them to move forward with a great deal of power and passion. So there's something there about knights being those who are in a position of taking action, moving forward, stepping out, and moving from point A to point B in a period of transition. So probably not people who are entirely sure of who they are yet, but they're on their way to finding out. Then we get to the kings and the queens. And the reason I'm taking these together is, and actually, by the way, there's a deck that I walked through a while ago called the 𝙍𝙀𝙎𝙆 Tarot, and it does something rather interesting with kings and queens. So it doesn't have separate king and queen cards, it has a single card that is the king and queen card. So it's a single card with both characters on it. And I think that's actually quite powerful, because for me, and I know that many people will disagree with this, but for me, the kings and queens are actually rather interchangeable in the tarot deck. They just represent different qualities of maturity, different qualities of authority. And the reason I take that approach is that the traditional way of thinking about a king and a queen is that the king is the big old boss who is the highest in the land, the monarch, and the queen is his wife. But in reality, that is not how monarchies work. In the UK, for example, where I am just now, we have got a queen, and the queen is the monarch, and we haven't got a king, we have got a prince. We have got Prince Philip, who is the queen's consort, but the queen is more senior in rank to him. She is the monarch of the UK. And for me, that's quite important, because I think quite often in a lot of tarot texts, you'll see that the sense that the king follows the queen in the sense of it's more advanced than the queen. And I don't see it that way. I just see it as different types of maturity. What I sometimes will see is that the queen represents a kind of stable, kind of receptive, introspective maturity, very calm and centered within herself, that style of maturity. And the king is a more kind of what one might call outward facing, authoritative, not necessarily in terms of holding authority, but in terms of expressing authority, presence, that is in the position of perhaps making things happen and being seen to make things happen in the external world as opposed to in the internal world. Now obviously in there are some, you might say there are some received wisdom perspectives in terms of the difference between male and female. So sometimes you hear about queens being the kind of passive element and kings being active. And I don't have a problem with that, because I maintain and remember for myself that I don't see passive as being negative compared to active. I just see it as being different too. If you're not happy with the word passive, then receptive, introspective might work. You can also see the king and queen as being the two different energies of yin and yang. And again, you know, if you look at the symbol in the 𝙇𝙄𝙉𝙆𝙎, in Taoism, of the yin and yang movement, they're not in any way, one is not better than the other. They are entirely equal. They are just different. They're kind of mirror images of each other, and each one carries the seed of the other. So that's how I would see the king and the queen. And that, of course, raises the question about what order do these appear in the tarot deck? And different tarot readers will say different things. One way of looking at it is to think about whether the court cards are representative of, a bit like a microcosm of the overall tarot deck, you know, from the Fool through to, we've looked at the constellation of the Fool, the constellation of 0 in the Fool, through to the constellation of the Hermit, and I've talked about how that sequence of numbers, the 0 through to the 9, represents this kind of progression of consciousness. the arising of consciousness from nothingness and then moving forward through this process of development, and self-consciousness arises, and the mankind's arrival is represented there, and then there's the point at which consciousness moves on to a different level and onto a new sequence of numbers which are founded on the original sequence of numbers. Well, you can look at the court card as a bit like a microcosm of that, and then the question comes: is the page arriving first on the scene? Does it come from, does innocence arrive and then develop into maturity? Or the other way of looking at it, and this is how some ceremonial magic traditions look at it, certainly the Golden Dawn and Aleister Crowley, talked about the idea of, if you map the kings and the queens and the knights and the pages onto the Kabbalistic tree of life, what you find is that actually from the emanation at the top of the Kabbalistic tree of life downwards, so this is kind of like the descent of spirit into matter, the kings come first. So the kings and the queens are way up there, and I can't remember the exact attributions, I'm not a Kabbalist, so this is just a general overview. The kings and queens are up there, and then it comes down to knights who are in that in the sphere that represents splendour, and then the pages are the ones who arrive in the sphere that represents earth. So they actually go in those tarot decks, we can think of them as going from the king through to the page as spirit descends into matter. So there's no right way of looking at this, particularly when you're not looking at numbers in relation to these cards. And that is one of the benefits of the court cards, because they don't have numbers. You're not wedded to the idea that they have to be in a particular order. You can put the kings first, moving through to the pages, or you can swap them around. Or I suppose you could jumble them all up. I've not actually seen that done with any degree of authority, but why not? Well, there's lots of reasons why not, but if you find a reason for doing it, then do it and let us know, because you might develop a whole new tarot court card system. So we've touched a bit on the fact that they can represent families, and when you're thinking about family, you can think in terms of, well, what are the family dynamics that are being played out there? Do they reflect the family dynamics that you might be dealing with in a tarot reading, either for yourself or others? You can look at them in terms of rank and royalty, and levels of, if you like, accepted authority. So authority that's accepted by society. Do you see any kind of reflection there in terms of where they might be? So you might find, for example, in a reading that kings and queens are likely to represent bosses, people who are in authority over you, and pages, if they appear in your reading, depending on your own age or your own status, may represent people who are younger than you or junior to you. That's one way of looking at it, but it's not the only way. So you can look at it in terms of family, you can look at it in terms of dynamics of rank and so on. You can look at it in terms of age, in terms of youth to older. The only thing I would say there is, of course, that levels of age and levels of maturity are different things. So I have known quite a lot of older people who are not terribly mature, and I've known quite a lot of younger people who are very mature, and of course vice versa. Of course there are young people who are not very mature and older people who are mature. But I have a problem with the idea that the court cards represent physical age. I tend to think of the court cards as being far more interesting if we look at them as representatives of qualities. And when it comes to age and maturity, what you might want to be careful of is being tripped up by the idea that pages have always got to be young. Perhaps not, but perhaps they do have something to tell us about beginner's mind, about youthful enthusiasm. And of course, youthful enthusiasm is something that can exist in an 80-year-old, particularly if that 80-year-old is doing something new. If you're doing something new at any age, then you are a youth to that thing. You are starting off with that thing. So rather than physical age, I would suggest to you that it's worth looking at these cards in terms of level of maturity. And in terms of gender, again, I think you can, of course, look at these cards as being representatives of the genders that they appear to be, but again, I would put to you that it is far more rich and far more rewarding to realise that kings can be male or female, queens can be male or female, knights can be male or female, pages can be male or female, or indeed, you know, if you're dealing with somebody who doesn't identify as male or female, they can still have the qualities represented by these suits. So the court cards represent a hugely rich tapestry of human life. The reason that many decks, of course, change the court cards and move away from kings and queens and knights and pages is for the reasons that we've described, that there is a tendency in our culture to default to ideas about what kingliness means and queenliness and so on. And we do tend to make associations, no matter how hard we try, with particular ranks and statuses and genders and so on. So I'm suggesting to you that we open all of that up and we realise that when we're dealing with different qualities, any one of these cards can be within you. In fact, I would say that every one of these cards is within you and within everyone else. And when they show up in a reading, really what they're doing is they're inviting you to notice which qualities are at play in yourself and in others. So that is a little bit about the court cards as people, either yourself or other people. And now let's talk a little bit about the court cards as personality types. Okay, so I'm going to be rather quick with this because I have actually done another video on the concept of Myers-Briggs as it relates to the tarot court cards, and that was actually a video response to a tag that was started by 𝙇𝙄𝙉𝙆𝙎. Hi 𝙇𝙄𝙉𝙆𝙎. And so I'll link that video below, and if you go to that video you'll find some information about how to find out what your Myers-Briggs personality type is and also which tarot card it relates to. But briefly, the principle is as follows. Carl Jung, the psychologist and psychiatrist, came up with the notion of different types of psychological functions, and those were intuition, sensation, feeling and thinking, and they were all to do with the way that we process information and the way that we express ourselves in the world in terms of the way our psyche interrelates with the world. And then some work was done a few years later by a mother-daughter team, Myers-Briggs, who took Jung's personality functions and enhanced them somewhat and elaborated on them somewhat, and looked at the way that they processed information in terms of judging or perceiving, and also looked at the way that Jung had discussed the way that those personality types could express themselves in the world in terms of being extroverted or introverted. And so basically you end up with different factors, a set of different factors, 8 different factors, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different things that you can be in relation to these different personality functions and drives, and they can appear in different combinations within you. 16 different combinations in fact. And of course we have 16 tarot court cards. Now by the way, the extroversion introversion axis doesn't relate only to the air cards and the sword cards, or intuition and sensation doesn't relate just to the cups. That's just the way I've written them on the board, but they don't relate in that way. How they do relate is that by looking at which one of these you are in each of these different continuum, if you like, you can then give yourself a 4-letter categorization which describes your personality type in relation to this Myers-Briggs system. So in my case, for example, usually when I do this, I come out as INFJ. And sometimes you will come out slightly differently at different times in your life, or depending on how you are expressing yourself in the moment. But you do have a kind of a core personality type that is yours, and that's why it pays to do a proper test around the Myers-Briggs system, so that you really get to the bottom of what your type is. So I usually come out as INFJ. Occasionally I come out as ENFJ, depending if I'm feeling a bit more introverted or extroverted. I am an introverted type, although I'm quite close to the introversion-extroversion central point. So I can nip over into extroversion when I need to. But my kind of dominant type, my dominant characteristic is definitely introverted. So I'm usually INFJ. I also sometimes come out as INTJ, depending on whether I'm kind of coming a bit more from my head or my heart, but usually INFJ. Now, what the system does is it describes these 16 different personality types, and what some very clever people have done is had a look at, well, which of the tarot court cards do these personality types relate to? And it really is quite interesting when you look at the court cards in relation to the personality types, because there are some interesting matches. And in fact, in his book, Understanding Aleister Crowley's Thoth Tarot, which is an excellent book by 𝙍𝙀𝙎𝙊𝙍𝘀𝙎, he makes the point that if the Myers-Briggs system had been in existence at the time that Crowley was working with the tarot court cards, 𝙍𝙀𝙎𝙊𝙍𝘀 is pretty certain, and I would agree with him, that Crowley would almost certainly have resonated with this system and probably would have used this system, because the way that he describes tarot court cards in relation to the way they are in the world matches very closely to the 16 different personality types. So here's mine. I am the Queen of Cups. That describes me in terms of my INFJ characteristic. As I say, occasionally I can come out as an extrovert, which would make me more like the King of Cups. But I also sometimes come out as an introverted thinking type. So sometimes the Queen of Wands. And I suppose you could say that, again, if I'm thinking a bit more and I'm being a bit extroverted, then I might come out as the King of Wands. Now that might sound as though I'm kind of just trying to have my cake and eat it and say I'm four of these 16 court cards. But it's really just to show you that actually, depending on where you fall on each of these axes, you can have a bit of leeway to look at the card that you relate to most. But as I say, Queen of Cups. Now I do actually, make sure I get these back in the right order. I do actually see a resonance there in terms of the extent to which I'm driven by my intuition and in touch with my intuition. That makes sense to me. So as I say, in the link below you'll find out a bit more about this. You'll see the video where I've discussed this at a bit more length, and also links to 𝙇𝙄𝙎𝙎𝙊𝙎𝙀𝙁 and some resources. But it is an interesting system. It's worth exploring. Now of course, when you're doing a tarot card reading, unless you're very familiar with this system and have memorized which one of these different types relates to which one of the cards, it may not be that much use to you. You know, if somebody is doing a reading and they suddenly turn over the Knight of Wands, you know, are you going to remember that in this system, the Knight of Wands is an ENTP, which means an extroverted, intuitive, thinking and perceiving person? Or are you actually going to need to find some kind of shorthand in your own mind for what the Knight of Wands means? So interesting for self-study. The jury for me is out on how useful it is directly for tarot reading, but it's certainly an interesting system of study all round. So I'd encourage you to find out more. Have a look at the video. All right, and now we're going to have a look at the other element that I want to look at, and that is in fact the elemental qualities of these cards. Back in a sec. Okay, so the court cards and the elements. Now, I happen to think that this is one of the most useful ways of looking at the court cards, because it allows us to look at the way that different energies interplay with each other. And what I mean by that is that when you look at the elemental attributes of the suits, so in the Rider-Waite system, we're looking at swords being air, cups being water, wands being fire, pentacles being earth. We can also look at what the different, let's say, ranks within the tarot court cards represent. And in this case, we look at pages being earth, knights being air, queens being water, and kings being fire. And what that allows us to do then is look at the combinations of energy. So if, for example, the Knight of Wands comes up within your reading, then what you're able to say is, well, this belongs to the suit of fire. So the main energy here is of fieriness, of that kind of energy. But the category that it fits into, the sub-element, if you like, is air. So this is the airy part of fire. And that tells us something about, well, how will that fiery energy play out? Will it be ultra powerful, driving forward, burning everything in its path? Or will it be potentially changeable? Will it be slightly wispy? Will it be fast moving? Will it have the potential of being blown out, etc., etc., etc.? You know, if you pull the Queen of Pentacles, it's earth. We're talking about earthiness here, but we're talking about the watery part of earth. So what does that mean? What does that tell us in terms of the way that solidity and earthiness will express itself? Will it be completely stable and still, or will it be kind of a flowing earthiness? Will it be an intuitive practicality? And in the case of the Queen of Pentacles, then according to this system, yes, it would. So what you find is, as long as you have an understanding of what the 4 elements relate to, then you instantly have an understanding of what each one of these cards relate to by combining the fundamental primary element, which is the element represented by the suit that the card comes from, with the elemental attribution of the rank of the card. So you always have 2, and that can be very, very helpful. However, things get a little bit complicated when you realise that there is not universal agreement about which cards relate to which elements, and that works in a couple of different ways. First of all, although probably in most systems that people are familiar with, the idea of swords being air, cups being water, wands being fire, and pentacles being earth is pretty standard and pretty familiar. But it's not always the case. Sometimes you find that wands and swords, for example, swap their elemental attributions. In the Masonic tarot, for example, the wands are air and the swords are fire. So it depends on the deck of cards you're using. Even more complicated is the way that the different ranks within the suit relate to the different elements. And again, the kind of, if you like, kind of standard way of looking at it, the way that it's kind of seen in the regular cards, or certainly in the 𝙍𝙄𝙉𝙆𝙎 cards, is that pages relate to earth, knights are air, queens are water, and kings are fire. But there's a bit of confusion around this, because some people would see the knights as being fire and the kings as being air. And I think where some of this comes from is that in the Golden Dawn system, and this is a system that those who are familiar with Crowley's Thoth Tarot will be aware of, the knights are the king card, the most senior card, for want of a better word, in the suit, which we think of in the Rider-Waite-Smith system as king, is actually knight. So in the Thoth system you have the knight, queen, prince and princess, and that's true of the Golden Dawn as well. Knight, queen, prince and princess. And in that system, the knight is fire. So the knight, this kind of driving force of the knight charging forward, does relate to fire. And the prince is the more airy part. And in some ways, from an elemental point of view, that seems to make a degree of sense. Where things get slightly complicated, and again, I'm not an expert in this, but a lot depends on how the cards are represented. In the pictorial key to the tarot, the way that Waite wrote the description for some of the cards, he specified that the cards had particular ages and so on, and then Pixie drew them in relation to some of those specifications, although not always entirely in line with the specifications. So we get some muddying of the waters in terms of, is it that the kingly card is the driving card astride its horse and is moving forward, and in some texts you'll find that the horse relates to the size of this individual's phallus. Or does it relate to just the kind of the energy in terms of the way that the card expresses itself? So there's a degree of confusion that's caused by that, and my only advice to you there is, find the system that works for you and stick with it, and see if you can understand how the attributions have been worked out. And that's not even going into something that is of great interest to many, and that is the kind of astrological attributions that can be put against these cards. The other thing that Crowley did was he looked at the decans of the zodiacal wheel, splitting the 360 degrees into different segments, then assigning one of these cards to each one of those segments of a certain number of degrees. All of that is worth looking at if you're interested in that kind of thing, but that helps explain how some of the elemental attributions work in respective decks. The other thing to say is that there are other people who relate these cards to the elements in different ways. So I've seen some videos, for example, where people say, I don't really see how the pages can be earth, because they're kind of so ingenue, like they're so new and fresh. Aren't they better attributed to air, say, because they're a little bit less definite in who and what they are. They're a bit more airy, if you like. And wouldn't it be better if the king actually related to the suit of earth? Because the king is the kind of ultimate expression of that suit in terms of solidity and sureness, etc., etc. So there's a logic to that as well. The reason, of course, that the pages are attributed, or one of the reasons that they're attributed to earth, goes back to what I said earlier, the idea of, if you're looking at the Kabbalistic associations of the emanation from spirit down into matter, moving down through the spheres of the tree of life, the pages represent that birth into the world of matter. So when you are a consciousness that is born into the world of matter, you are ingenue-like, but you are of the earth plane, and that is that's why the pages can be related to earth. So there's a logic either way. What I think is important is that you find what works best for you and that makes sense to you. So some tarot writers have written that actually they relate the pages to earth. Some would say that it's air. Some with the knights say that the knights represent air because they're fast moving and fleet of foot. And others would say it's fire because of that kind of energetic approach to things. Some would say that the king is actually more to do with air because he is the one who has to really think things through and intellectualize and be a good ruler and a good leader by using his mental capacities. And others would say, no, the king is fire because it's the most powerful, energetic element, and the king is the most powerful of the tarot suit cards. The one card that generally doesn't have all of this drama around her is the Queen, who almost universally in every system is seen to be water. And I think it's brilliant that the Queen is this kind of almost universally watery character, because for me, when queens come up in the reading, queens to me represent a kind of a level of maturity and sureness that is just unsurpassed. It's like being completely comfortable in your own skin, not feeling the need to make things happen in the external world, not even being in a position of thinking that the external world is the most important thing. It's that kind of seat of the heart, rooted in the intuition, loving kind of place. That to me is what the queens relate to, and so it makes sense to me that the queens are almost universally kind of related to water. And I actually think the queens wouldn't care one way or the other. I think we could debate what the queens are and whether they're air of this or fire of that or whatever, and I think they would just be absolutely cool with it, zen-like in their calm. And that's not to say that the queens aren't feisty, it's just to say that they are at peace with themselves. And I love it when a queen card comes up in a reading for me. For me, it just, I just feel this sense of confidence with the queens. So, yeah, but that's just my impression. So that is a little quick canter, or not so quick canter, through the idea of the elemental attributions. And I'm going to give you a bit of homework. We're not quite finished the video yet, but I'm going to give you a little bit of homework. And that is to take your favourite tarot deck. And I want you to, first of all, get a bit of paper, and down one side of the paper I want you to write the 4 elements: air, water, fire, earth, in any order you like, doesn't matter. And then the same up at the top: air, earth, fire, water, in any order that you like, it does not matter. And then I want you to take the court cards from your favourite tarot deck. I want you to try to forget everything that you already know about the court cards, everything you've been told in the past, everything you've just been told in this video. I want you to try as best you can to put it out of your mind. And I want you to study these cards one by one. Meditate on them. I want you to look at them, I want you to feel them. If you want to do a path working with them and step into the card, do that. Record your first impressions. Just allow yourself to be talked to by that card, and let the card tell you whether, from a suit point of view, it is part of the air, water, fire or earth suit, or indeed whether it itself is expressing the quality of earth, air, water or fire. Now, if you want to make it even simpler, and you don't want to do all this stuff about how the different elements combine, then look at each one of those cards, each one of those tarot court cards, and allow it to tell you what its primary element is. So when you hold the Queen of Wands up in front of you and you look at the Queen of Wands, does she tell you that she is mainly fiery, or mainly watery, or mainly airy, or mainly earthy? Allow yourself to do that, and once you've done it, then you can compare and contrast what you felt with what others say. Now, I know that this is not a perfect exercise because it's going to be completely impossible for you to entirely empty your mind of what you've already learned, but as best you can, see if you can take a fresh look at these cards and a fresh look at their elemental qualities. Okay, so that is the elemental aspect of the court cards. And now, to finish with, I'm going to give you a little bonus as well actually, but to finish with, we're going to talk about these cards in relation to where they come in the sequence of numbers. So we're looping right back to Tarot to the Nines next. Okay, the court cards and number. How does that work? So, I'm not going to do a repeat of everything I've said throughout the rest of this series. You need to go back and look at the videos if you don't remember any of this. But what we've talked about is the notion of the evolution of number, and therefore the evolution of consciousness and the evolution of places within a sequence of events or qualities or energies, etc., etc. We started with 0, the nothingness, the void. From that came 1, and then the 2, and then the 3, and then all the rest. And we went all the way up to 9, the final constellation, the last of the root numbers. 10 then takes us up to the new level. Remember, 9 is that spiral that spirals up the way onto a new level. Number 10 is really just a higher octave of 1, because 1 plus 0 equals 1. Remember that from your Pythagorean reduction. Which means that we're still very much at the beginning of the sequence when we get to the page, if the page is seen as representing number 11. Now, I know that many people would say, but the court cards aren't numbers. They haven't got numbers on them. You can't use numbers with the court cards. Well, to that I say, yes, the court cards do not have numbers on them, and that is a good thing, because that opens them up into all kinds of interesting interpretations. And we just talked about some of those, the idea of personality types, of individuals, of different elemental attributes and so on. But just because they don't have numbers on them doesn't mean that they can't be seen as numerically significant. And particularly in terms of places on a sequence of development, I think it is useful to consider them, at least from the point of view of number. So let's just, bear with me and see where this goes. So if the page is number 11, that makes sense, because the page is still early on in the new sequence, at this new level of evolution, and pages are the ingenue, the newness, the originality in the court card. So that kind of makes sense. But the interesting thing about it is, as well as being at the beginning, the fact that it's number 11 tells us that it belongs to a particular constellation. Do you remember which one it is? 11. 1 plus 1 equals 2. So we're in the second constellation, the constellation of the High Priestess. So what does that tell you about pages and some of the qualities that pages have? What would being a member of the constellation of the High Priestess mean for the pages? Is it something to do with intuition? Is it something to do with hidden knowledge, etc., etc., etc.? Is it something to do with coming out from behind the veil, which might make sense if this is if the pages arrive into the manifested world from, remember that step down in the Kabbalah, the idea of the energy and the spirit stepping down through the different spheres of the tree of life and coming into the manifested world as the pages. So there we are. That also would then mean that the knights, if they're number 12, belong to the constellation of the Empress. The queens, if they're 13, belong to the constellation of the Emperor. Kind of interesting when you think about it. Remember what I said earlier about the queens not necessarily meaning more junior to the kings, and also not necessarily meaning women, or even that kind of female representation. So they belong to the constellation of the Emperor, if we look at this numerical sequence. And then the King of Wands, any of the kings, if they represent the 14s, they belong to the constellation of the Hierophant. So what does that tell you about the kings if they are part of the constellation of the Hierophant? So it's quite interesting to consider these court cards from the point of view of number. However, as ever with the court cards, they do not like to play nice. They like to make things difficult for us. And whilst it makes sense that we look at them in this direction, we have to bear in mind that not everyone does. So some people look at the cards going in this sequence. But actually, now some would argue that it's not necessarily 0 to 10 and then the king. Some people would argue that actually it's 10 to 0 and then the king, or 10 to 1 and then the king. So, but nonetheless, in terms of the order of the courts, if the king comes first, it's the king that belongs to the constellation of the High Priestess. If it's the queen that comes next, the queen belongs to the constellation of the Empress, which just in some extent would make more sense. And the knight belongs to the constellation of the Emperor, again, perhaps some sense there, and the page belonging to the constellation of the Hierophant. So that's another way of looking at it. Some people do. I don't. I do tend to think in terms of, if you like, the traditional order. And from my point of view, for a number of different reasons, this order makes sense to me, both in terms of the sequence, but also in terms of where they belong in the numbers. But you don't even need to consider this in terms of numbers or sequence. You know, one of the things that Gail Fairfield does is she looks at the way that the numbers are grouped together, and she actually groups them together in different clusters. I think she, if I remember correctly, starting at the 1, she groups together the first 3, then the next 3, then the next 3, and then she sees the 10 as being a kind of transition point to a new level, and then she groups the next 3 together, and then the king is a kind of completion point. So there are different ways of looking at it. So I actually think it's quite interesting to look at these cards in relation to number. It just adds nuance, it adds richness to your reading. It doesn't mean that you have to throw out the idea that the cards are numberless. It just means that you've got an extra template to consider them from. Now I've got a quick question for you, a bit of a test. Why might I say, I'm just basing this on the cards that I happen to have chosen to put up here. Based on what I said earlier about the elements, why might I say that this page, the Page of Pentacles, is the pagiest page? Why might I say that this Knight of Swords is the knightiest knight? The Queen of Cups is the queeniest cup, or the queeniest queen, and the King of Wands is the kingiest king. I'll give you a moment to think about that. Okay, have you thought? Kind of obvious if you remember what I said about the elemental attributions. The way that I use the elements is pages relate to earth, and this is the earth suit. So this is earth of earth, the pagiest page. This is air of air, the airiest air. This is the water of water, the wateriest water, and the queeniest queen. And this is the fire of fire, the kingiest king. That's why I selected those. So we have looked at the court cards as though they were people, as though they were personalities, whether they were you or somebody else. We've looked at them in relation to elements. We've looked at them in relation to the sequence of numbers. We've looked at them at how they group together in terms of the constellations. Another thing you might want to consider is, certainly in terms of the kings and queens, is there is an argument to say that the kings are ambassadors of the emperor and the queens are ambassadors of the Empress. So although they don't necessarily belong specifically to those constellations, certainly not in my iteration, you can see some connections there. So there are different ways of looking at the court card, is what I'm trying to say, and it can get complicated and it can get confusing. If you try and hold them all in your mind and try and fit them all together and integrate them together, you might struggle to do that. So 2 things I want to say. The first thing I want to say is, does it matter which one you choose? And the answer is no, not really, as long as it works for you. What I think is more important than picking the right, the correct system to use, is that whatever system you opt for, it has coherence for you and you find yourself able to use it consistently. If you find that it doesn't make sense to you, then it will be constantly jarring if you're trying to apply that system to your readings. And equally, if you find that it sometimes makes sense but sometimes doesn't, and it isn't very coherent within your mind, that will be difficult too. So I would urge you to just go with what works for you in terms of coherence and consistency. The other thing to say is you don't necessarily need to have a system. Some people are entirely intuitive tarot readers, and so they respond to the cards as the cards speak to them. So the Knight of Swords may say different things to you in different situations, may represent different qualities in different situations, and if you're the kind of reader who works better that way, that is your system. Be consistent within that and be coherent within that, and that is how you'll be able to adapt to the tarot court cards. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. And the second thing I wanted to say was, I want to hear from you how you think of the tarot court cards. Do you agree with some of the elemental attributions I have discussed? Do you prefer the Golden Dawn way of doing things, or do you prefer another system? Do you think that it is confusing in terms of who's the knight, who's the king, who's air, who's fire? Or does it not really matter to you? And since this is Tarot to the Nines, do you think it is useful to look at these cards in any way in relation to number, or do you think that adds unnecessary confusion and complexity and possibly restriction? I want to know. So that's your other piece of homework. Apart from working out your elemental attributions for yourself, I want you to have to think about your overall view of how to look at the court cards, and please post your comments below, or indeed in the Tarot to the Nines Facebook group, and again the link for that is below. So that has been the Tarot Court Cards video, and we have now gone through every single deck of cards in the tarot deck. So if you want to go back and look at the videos and do a proper study of every card, then you can now do that. We're at the point now where I have certainly said everything I wanted to say in this series about every single card. I have got a couple of other videos to do before we close Tarot to the Nines, and those videos are of course looking at some of the resources that you can use in this course of study. So I'll be back soon with my top tips for Tarot to the Nines resources and recommended reads, etc. So until then, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you again very soon. Bye.